Hello everybody, I am Jarrett Ross, the GeneaVlogger, and on today's video, I'm going to be checking out some different genealogy polls that I've run through my community tab. For anyone that follows my channel or gets my community posts in their feed, you'll probably know that I do a lot of polls about family trees and trying to get people to look at their trees a little bit differently. But then I also do kind of just generic random polls as well. So we're going to go through some of the results of those. And if you enjoy this video, be sure to comment below and let me know, because maybe then I'll do more like these in the future, because I've done a lot of polls. Now the first poll is from over a year ago. Have any of your ancestors had children with more than one partner? If so, how far back is the most recent ancestor to do so? So in this poll, 17% said they don't know of any. 26% said their parents had children with another spouse, or not necessarily a spouse, I guess, but that basically means that they have half siblings. So over a quarter of the people that responded, which just about 2,000 people, so that means about 500 of people that took this poll have half siblings. 22% said their grandparents had children with more than one partner, 18% their great-grandparents, and 17% second great-grandparents or further back. I probably should have worded this poll as the most recent ancestor that had children with more than one partner, but I'm guessing that's kind of what people assumed anyway. Maybe not, I don't know. So for the next poll, in how many countries do you have blood relatives where you know exactly how they are related? And for me, I know of cousins in over 15 countries, but that includes very distant cousins because I've done a lot of research and tried to connect with a lot of my relatives. We had 1.7 thousand people respond. 36% said they don't know of any relatives outside of their own country. 20% said that they knew of relatives in at least two. 15% said at least 3, 8% said 4, and then 21% said 5 or more, which I think kind of makes sense, just in the sense that, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all the people probably like me who have done a lot of genealogy research found relatives. So, it's kind of skewed. I wish YouTube allowed me to have like 10 entries, because with only 5 entries, you're really limited. And I get comments all the time about, well, why didn't you include this? Why didn't you do that? And it's just like, well, I don't have the room. If only I could. I got to figure out how to fit it into 5. So now this poll is really funny because it's just, it's a quick one from a year ago. I have been working on some more in-depth topic videos, and I'm quite excited about them. Which videos do you most look forward to see? And of all of these 5, 4 of them I've already released, and only one of them I'm actually haven't released, but I'm working on it right now. So by the time this video comes out, it may have come out, or it'll be the video coming out not too long after that. And that one's the genetic genealogy tools I'd like to see. So I'm working on that one right now. But all these others, Olam, Zionism's older brother, the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, the truth about Jewish pirates of the Caribbean, and Terra Santa, 400 years of Sephardic support for Israel. All of those are up and available. So if you haven't watched them, go and check them out. So this question had 1.1 thousand votes, and that was how many of your direct ancestors were alive in 1950? And the reason why I posted this one was because the 1950 census became public on April 1st, after 72 years, because in the U.S. the law is 72 years from when the censuses go public. So in 2000 and 2032, then the 1960 census will come out. For the respondents, 10% didn't know, or they had none alive. Although I kind of doubt that. I'm sure for everyone there was at least one ancestor alive in the 1950s. 3 or less, so 6%. And honestly, I think the only people that technically would be in none are people that were born before 1950 and then all of their ancestors had died by then, which certainly is possible. 3 or less got 6%, and then it jumped up greatly when it went to 4 to 8, which is 32%, which I think that makes sense. I'm guessing a lot of people that were answering this poll are either, they're probably either Gen X, Gen Z, or Gen Y. Basically, it's mostly people born in like the 70s and onward. Back to the poll, 4 to 8 were 32%. 27% said they had 9 to 13, which is where I fall in. And then 26% said they had 14 or more, which I'm guessing a lot of that 14 or more probably were Gen Zers or younger millennials. I will say, though, there's a big generation gap for me between myself and my parents. And then there's also a big generation gap between my dad and his parents. Especially for the average. So that, that probably tweaks it a bit. But I imagine that a lot of the people that were answering this poll that were young or older millennials, Gen Xers, and then most especially any baby boomers, they probably were in the lower amount, in that 4 to 8 and then the 3 or less. So this poll, how many known siblings did all of your grandparents have in total? For me, it's 14. And that breakdown is each of my maternal grandparents only had one sibling. So my maternal grandmother and then my maternal grandfather both only had one sibling. My grandfather had a sister. My grandmother had a sister. And then my paternal grandfather, my father's father, had 7. And my paternal grandmother had 5. And going from the oldest sibling to the youngest sibling, as I list here, my great aunt Molly Jampolsky, born Goldberg, was born in 1894. She's the oldest, and then the youngest of all of my grandparents' siblings is my maternal grandfather's sister, my great aunt Jane Perry, who was born in 1931. So she was the youngest. So 37-year span of when my grandparents' generation was born. Spanned 37 years. I always find that kind of stuff interesting, which is why I started doing these polls. But the responses, we have 4% none or don't know of any, 4 or less 7%, 31% 5 to 12, which then ties with 20 or more as well, and then 27% at 13 to 20. And I think this kind of makes a little bit of sense in, for one, with 4 grandparents, I feel like most people of that generation, they weren't necessarily like huge families of like 10, 12, 15, which you often find much earlier, in the 18th century and 19th century and stuff like that. For most people's grandparents, my generation, most of the grandparents were born in probably the 20s to 40s. And then, Gen Zers, their grandparents are my parents' generation, which, a lot of those people, were born in the 1950s and the 1960s. And so, so it kind of makes sense with, that 4 or less. That would either mean that, each of your grandparents only had one sibling or less. But I think most they have a few. And so then the 5 to 12 gets a lot. But then that 20 or more, it's not that much more than the 13 to 20 breakdown. But it's probably just because, like I mentioned in previous polls, when you have that longer range, 20 or more, it's going to lump in a lot more folks. What is the average age of all of your great-grandparents? If any are still living, just use their current age in the estimate. And if any are unknown, just use the ones that you know. And this one's from a year ago, and it had 1.1 thousand votes. And with my answer, it's 77 years and 4 months. And 16% said that they don't know any of their great-grandparents, which I'm guessing it's probably not necessarily that they don't know any of their great-grandparents. It's probably just a lot of people that it was more of show me the poll. I don't want to figure it out for myself. So whatever. But 1% said 50 years or less, which makes sense because if the average age was 50 years or less, that'd be very, very young and tragic deaths most likely. And so with 1% of 1.1 thousand, I mean, that's, just about a little under a dozen people. So it's still kind of interesting. Then 51 years to 65 years, which is still a pretty low amount, especially considering this is an average. So, that would mean that I'm guessing people where they're falling in these averages in the 50 years or less and in the 51 to 65, they may be dealing with a great-grandparent who had a very short life, possibly dying in their 20s or 30s. And, especially if they have that and then a couple of great-grandparents that only lived into their 50s or 60s or even 70s, it's going to sway a lot more in the lower amounts. But it definitely makes sense that then once you get to 66 years to 80 years, it jumps up to 40%. which it makes a lot of sense, most likely, or most especially because that's usually where the average life expectancy falls. But the 81 years or more at 39% is a little surprising to me. I didn't think that that would be so high. Looking back at the poll, part of me wishes that I had done it a little bit differently. And instead of doing 50 years or less, I should have done 65 years or less, and then done like 66 to 75 years, and then 76 to 85 years, and then 86 to more, something like that. Because I'd be curious to see if that really changed the breakdown, because it's obvious that, 79% of people responding, so over 800 people out of the 1.1 thousand that responded, the average age of all of their great-grandparents was over 66 years. So if I kind of tweaked that poll a bit more, even if I did 70 years or less as the first option, it just, I think that would change it. Maybe I'll redo this poll and do it like that. I don't know. We'll see. Comment below. Should I do that? So this was the Mother's Day post from last year. So I know now that this is just a little over a year ago, and we're about to hit the marks where they're less than a year old. And my Mother's Day post was, how far back do you have your purely maternal line traced? So that's tracing your mother's line, and so on. And for me, it's back to my second great-grandmother, Rachel Casino, who we know her last name is Skavatsky, but sometimes she's listed as Shoemaker. So now this poll had 1.5 thousand votes. So 1% said that they don't know their mother. 1% said that they knew only their mother is the furthest point. And, this, you can kind of see that even though, they're both 1%, looks like don't know my mother's probably 0.5%, and then mother's probably somewhere between it's probably closer to 1.5%, but rounding up and rounding down. Then for grandmother, only 8% only knew up to their grandmother. 18% only knew up to their great-grandmother, and then 72% knew their second great-grandmother or further. And I will say I'm a little surprised at how high that was. I was expecting a good percentage. Anyone who's into genealogy is going to know they're, more than likely know past that second great-grandmother. But like looking at me, I'm all about genealogy. I have YouTube channels about it. It's my career and all that. But, my brick wall on my maternal line is that second great-grandmother. So I think I was expecting more around like a 50% amount. So the 72% is definitely a bit higher than I expected. But definitely one of those polls that I really, really wish that I had more options, because if I could get it up to fifth great-grandparents or fifth great-grandmother, I'd be really interested to see when does it start going back down. Because it's obviously going up with mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, second great-grandparents. But does it start going down at third? Does it start going down at fourth? Because that then really gives you more of an idea of how far, what's the average distance for my viewer's maternal line. Now this one was kind of an interesting one because it was a little bit different than usual. Last year I read an article about a couple doing a DNA test, getting results that they were about third cousins. And then genealogy research showed they were actually second cousins. They subsequently broke up. If you found out you were related to your significant other, how closely related would you have to be to break up? Now, for me, I honestly don't know how I would really answer this question. I feel like it would be maybe fifth or sixth cousins or even more distant or something. But also for me, I've spent so much time reaching out to like hundreds of fourth cousins, hundreds of fifth cousins, hundreds of sixth cousins. So like, I don't know how it would affect me to like, be in a relationship with someone and then to find out that we were, related in some way. And, how close to be like, okay, I can't handle this relationship anymore. We are too closely related. But for the poll, we have second cousins were at 62%. So 62% of the 1,000 votes, so about 620 people, said that if they found out that it was more distant than a second cousin, they wouldn't break up. Or at least, that's the way that I tried to word the poll. So I don't know if everyone answering it understood that was the meaning that I had behind it in a sense. But then it drops off greatly. Third cousins at 17%, fourth cousins at 8%, fifth cousins at 4%, which I can definitely understand. Once you get into the fourth and fifth cousins, I think that's definitely like, there's not necessarily a genetic issue, and, you know, it'd be very, very minimal that something would be an issue. But at the same time, it's like, I don't know if that information would affect me to the point of like, I'm totally creeped out. But I thought it was interesting, this 9% six cousins or further. I mean, I guess it's one of those, you know, so many options lumped in there. But I was a little surprised that that was so much higher than fifth cousins and even fourth cousins. Something interesting to think about is that with six cousins, you're looking at a deal of, let's see, you'd be sharing ancestors in like the 1700s. Honestly, there's probably a lot of people in the world who know a lot of their six cousins, but do not realize that they are their six cousins, most especially people that are in places that their family has been for many generations. Like if your family's been in a town, or like even just kind of like a small area, or like if you're in the US, if your family's been in, you know, a certain area in a state for, you know, hundreds of years, you probably know a lot of your relatives and may not realize it. And may have even dated them too. Have you ever attended a family reunion? If so, about how many people were in attendance? And I actually talk about that I had a family reunion in 2019 with my Rosenberg and Waxman relatives. About 30 of us were in attendance. And just kind of a funny aside, I hired a new editor who, this is his first video editing for me. And he's a cousin of mine through the Waxman family. So just kind of a fun aside while I'm reading this. So shout out to Ross. Throw a picture of yourself in there if you want to, Ross.
Hey.
But anyway, I think it's funny too. His name's Ross. And then this was at my family's restaurant or what used to be my family's restaurant in Germantown, Pennsylvania, called the Ross House. And they owned that until 1963, which they then sold it. Now it's actually a Irish club. It's on the corner of Emlyn and Carpenter Lane. So if you want to look it up, that's the old Ross House. But we had a reunion there a few years ago, and it was really, really cool. Now we had 1.3 thousand people respond. 34% said no, they have not ever attended a family reunion. 5% said yes, they've done that where it's less than 15 relatives, which I thought actually I'd get a bigger response with that, because I figured, you know, for a lot of families, I guess it's how you define a family reunion, but for a lot of families, you know, technically there's not a lot of reunions per se, and when, you know, a group of relatives gets together, which is probably, you know, when I think of a group like 15 or less, that would be a family reunion, which I've done a lot of those, you know, little mini family reunions where it's, you know, me and a handful of other cousins all meeting together and, you know, doing that kind of stuff. So only 5% said that. 17% said yes, 16 to 30 relatives, which is where that family reunion I did fell. 18% said yes to 31 to 50 relatives. So that's pretty big family reunions. And then I was really surprised that 26%, so more than a quarter of the people responding, said that yes, they've attended family reunions with more than 51 relatives. So I was honestly surprised by that. But I guess one thing I do wonder is how many people answered no that may actually fall into the yes, less than 15 relatives. I guess, you know, it depends on how you define a family reunion. In my mind, I think family reunion is when multiple relatives get together that all share a common ancestry but rarely see each other, at least all together as a group. Let's say, you know, you have a couple of cousins where it's like, you know, your mom's siblings, and then every once in a while you all get together as some sort of group, you know. Technically that's a family reunion to me, you know, but I guess, you know, comment below. Let me know. What do you think? Is that a family reunion? How many of your second great grandparents have you identified? Pretty much everyone has 16 unless you descend from a relationship between relatives, basically pedigree collapse. And for me, I've identified 14 of my 16. And the reason it's only 14 and not 16 is because my great grandmother Fanny, my paternal grandfather's mother, she's been the biggest brick wall I've had forever. It used to be her and her husband, my great-grandfather David Goldberg, who were my two biggest brick walls, but over the past 6 to 7 years, I've made huge strides in expanding my Goldberg family, most especially in thanks to DNA testing. But in the responses, we had 11% that said none. They've identified none of them. Although I'm guessing part of that, as usual, are the people that are just too lazy to even see if any have been identified. 14% said 4 or less, which I was a little surprised that it was that high. But I guess that does kind of make sense in some ways, because I do have a big amount of audience who come from, adoptions or have NPEs in their family or just other things that make it so that they may know a lot less about, certain sides. Then 9% said 5 to 9. 19% said 10 to 15. And then this was surprising, it was that high. 47% said that they know all 16. So almost half of the people responding, which I had 1.1 thousand. So a little bit higher than I thought. I figured it would be above 30%, but I didn't know if it would be that much. So finally, we get polls that are less than a year old. How long was the longest marriage between all of your 4 sets of great-grandparents, or at least those you know of, measuring from the date of the marriage to the date of divorce or date of death of the first spouse? So basically, once the spouse dies, till death do you part, in a sense. So once one spouse dies, that's when you define it. So for me, it was my great-grandparents, Harry Ross, who was born Harry Rosenberg, and Pearl Waxman, who was born Pearl Vaxer. And they were married on January 28th, 1908. And Harry passed away on November 17th, 1962, making it 54 years and 10 months of marriage. But this one had a lot fewer responses, only 642, 12% of whom said none married or they don't know. I'm guessing that's mostly don't know or don't care, just show me the results. 2% said 15 years or less. 4% said 15 years and 1 month to 30 years. And I started doing 15 years and 1 month because I had people responding in previous polls like, well, you said 1 year or 2 years, but what about 1 year and 6 months or 1 year and 8 months? Got to try to appease everybody as best possible. So that was my solution. But anyway, 4% said 15 years and 1 month to 30 years. And then a huge jump up to 12% saying 30 years and 1 month to 45 years, which makes, it makes a lot of sense. I feel like that's kind of a typical amount in a sense of like, when you're looking at the longest one, then you're probably going to have at least one set of your 4 great-grandparents that will last a good amount of time. And then it jumps up immensely once you do 45 years and 1 month or more to 71%. And that makes sense in the same sense of what I just said, where, if we're looking at the longest one out of, the 4, especially considering that I feel like divorce rates for those, those generations that are typical great-grandparents of the people that watch my videos, that, there wasn't as much divorce or, things like that, although there was a lot more common early deaths. But, when looking at the longest, yeah, it makes sense that it's that many. And then, have you ever used Find a Grave? I had 1,000 people respond, and this one was one of my first that was really not necessarily as much about a family tree, but more about, what about you? Well, I guess a lot of the polls are what about you anyway, but it's, you're researching or what you do online. And so 1,000 people responded, 22% said they've never even heard of Find a Grave. Although I'm guessing a lot of them looked it up after I did this poll. 13% said that they heard of it, but they've never used it, which I think makes sense. It's one of those websites that it has been around. A lot of different researchers, not just genealogists, use it in different capacities. So people have probably heard of it, or they see, if you Google stuff, Find a Grave is one of those links that can show up in the higher rankings. Then we have 27% said, yes, I've used it a few times, which I'm guessing most of those are probably people where they found a link or something on their family, a family member on Find a Grave, went, looked at it, maybe clicked around a bit, and that was it. 30% say, yes, I use it for research. And I wish that I could have it broken down with, yes, I use it for genealogy research, and then, yes, I use it for other research, because I think that'd be a really interesting thing to see is how many people are using this for something other than genealogy, which I feel like a large portion of the people using that website use it for genealogy. And then 8% of the 1,000 people responding. So 80 people who watch my videos say yes, or at least 80 people who responded to this poll said, yes, I'm an active user who adds new memorials. And for this one, hopefully everyone responded that, you know, even if you've only added one or two, basically I was looking for people where they were active to the point of just beyond clicking around and using it for research, but actually adding information to it, even if it's very minimal amount. So 8% is very interesting. But an interesting thing with this poll was this one was actually done because at the time I was working on a video about some issues with Find a Grave, which led me to title that video, The Curious Case of the Body Counters. And if you want to check that video out, be sure to click right here. Thank you to my Patreon patrons and YouTube members.